Hello, and welcome to In Pursuit of Clarity, episode number 46, entitled A Return to the Land, A Return to Fundamentals. I was pleased to see just how much the last video, entitled A Call to Return to the Land, resonated with a great many of you. I knew the idea was one whose time had come, and one that many of us had been harboring in various forms for quite a while now. But even still, I expected this would be a heavily throttled video with lower traffic and engagement and feedback, and that it might take some time and some doing to get people sufficiently intrigued with this path to start a ball rolling. Several people asked why there wasn't a clear call to action within the video itself. I very purposefully didn't include this because I didn't feel like I could include such a thing just yet. I couldn't possibly create an avenue to take in any money or begin channeling anyone's time and energy in any given direction until there's much more concrete clarity, until the ideas presented were allowed to be discussed and debated, and a clear path forward might be created as a result. One that makes sense at a glance and is readily understandable to all. The first step in this process, of course, is to simply put the ideas out there and allow them to ruminate and take root in people's minds. And then allow their resulting feedback to do the same for me, producing a back and forth that helps us refine and improve and generally flesh these things out. I've received quite a bit of feedback, public and private, from all types. Those with all of the necessary skill sets to make this work in a physical and real-world, on-the-ground sense. Those who've already created or participated in the creation of similar communities and have great insights to share. Those blessed with financial success, willing to invest in various ways. Those with crypto or blockchain or OPSEC experience with novel ideas. In short, people from every sphere. This is extremely encouraging, and I feel just further goes to show that all we really need is some organization and structure. Meaning the ability to bring these people together in a way that allows them to focus on their area of expertise, as others focus on theirs, and everyone plays their ideal specific role, a bit like limbs or organs in a larger body. Roughly the first half of this audiocast will be devoted to answering outstanding questions, comments, or critiques on the video and the broader idea. The second half will be devoted to announcing the first meeting and discussion, and providing some advice on how these discussions might take place. If you'd like to participate or listen in to the Twitter Spaces committee meetings, and you're listening to this to better understand that process, feel free to skip to about 40 minutes in. So to begin, I wanted to bring together the most hardline critiques and constructive criticism from scanning all comments and messages and emails, which I hope to, quote, steelman here, to give the fairest possible hearing, and then to provide some answers and responses as a means of further clarifying and explaining things. And so, to dive right in, number 1, a handful of commenters mentioned that others are already doing similar things, and asked the equivalent of, why reinvent the wheel? This is a good question, and it's so important to communicate that I absolutely don't want us to spend time and energy reinventing any wheels. One of the most intriguing elements of the committee idea, a group that would meet once per week to hold fruitful discussions as to how to best organize and structure and channel our energies, is that this group might heavily prioritize outreach to individuals and groups who have done or are doing similar things, to learn everything we possibly can from them, and their successes and failures, and perhaps, in some cases, to add them to our broader network of sorts, and stay in regular contact. Some of these existing communities may even be ideal places for a few of us to physically move to, but we'll still need some structure in place to allow us to expand much further than what exists at present. So while I envision these groups like the Mennonites or Amish or enclaves in South America or South Africa might be a tremendous help to us, as hopefully we might eventually be to them as well, we'll need to be able to expand far beyond what's currently being done, ideally. I'd love to see an opportunity exist for nearly every individual who's willing to both relocate and work, or dedicate themselves to learning a valuable skill set to eventually work. And I suspect this is a large and growing number. And we can't exclusively rely on the patchwork of smaller communities that exist at present to accomplish these aims. After all, the goal that appealed to so many was the gradual reclamation of the land. And this requires us to think bigger than what currently exists in these spheres. Number 2, many asked if this was an America-specific project, or if it might be international in scope. I was purposefully a bit vague here for this reason. There's little doubt in my mind that America seems to represent perhaps the best opportunities here for many reasons. In part because it still maintains the largest Western or European population on Earth, and in part because there's a great deal of largely unoccupied and untouched and undeveloped land. And land that's often easier to obtain than it might be in other nations. And that much of this land, that might presently be in a dire state, could potentially be bought at a value and significantly improved with time and effort. So it might be said that the U.S. is a focus here, but certainly not the exclusive focus. And all of this depends on where our discussions lead us. I very consciously didn't want to be overly limiting here, because I know there's immense promise in other pockets of the world, some of which would offer land far more cheaply than the U.S. Our broader network of communities could absolutely be international in scope, and personally speaking, I'd welcome this. But again, like so much else, this is one of the many things we might settle in our committee discussions over time. Perhaps there's some downside of not focusing exclusively on the United States that I'm not yet considering. Or perhaps there's even tremendous upside in largely focusing elsewhere. I suspect after our first 3 or 4 meetings, the answers to these questions will be much clearer. Number 3. A handful of people, thankfully very small, but still notable, seemed to have a fatalistic, dismissive attitude. Whether it be a certain type of Christian who believes all things are hopelessly crumbling, so there's no point in even trying, or a firm believer in Kali Yuga cycles, who holds similar beliefs for similar reasons. I do certainly understand where you're coming from, but I completely and totally reject these ideas and want no part of them, and want no relationships or alliances with any who think this way. This might be the single most dangerous of all theories and states of mind, and I've always felt that this type of attitude and this specific form of demoralization represents the purest form of subversive demoralization. We're not without agency unless we convince ourselves we're without agency. And in fact, we're called upon to fight the good fight to the best of our ability, across nearly every major doctrine or ideology or religion embraced by Western mankind. We're called to be proper stewards of the earth and God's creation. Arjuna on the battlefield is shamed for his cowardice and told to fight. The Norse tradition reserves Valhalla for the courageous and valiant. This type of paralysis, caused by weak-kneed fatalists and nihilists, looks ridiculous from a broader historical perspective. Had similar thinking and ideas been adopted by our ancestors, you and I wouldn't be here today. Mankind wouldn't be here today. I just have no time for this mode of thinking, and I'd encourage you all to reject it just as strongly. It's sickly, putrid air, and its net effect is to allow the very worst sorts of people to slither into positions of total dominance with ever greater ease, despite their small number, their lack of ability, virtue, or nobility, and despite their being completely undeserving of such roles. It's a cancerous mode of thought, and those who play the leading roles in overcoming the obstacles currently facing us will be those capable of always finding that inner wellspring of robust health and vitality and energy, regardless of the prevailing conditions around them. Number 4. Some spoke of human nature being so innately sick that such communities could never possibly flourish, or even exist in the first place, because some corrupting force will always rise to the top and twist them into something vastly inferior to what they set out to be. For many, this is a compelling argument, especially as we look around ourselves today in the modern world. It's so easy to believe that the natural state of all human beings is to be base and ignoble, treacherous, corrupt, dishonest, degenerate, completely self-interested, etc. A careful reading of history disproves this as some hard and fast, unbreakable rule. And I've tried to focus on these very brighter high points in my own work. Namely, those nations and epochs in which a higher culture developed, allowing people to hold themselves and one another to higher standards, especially in the realm of honesty, civility, grace, and nobility, which sets the stage for a flourishing of competence and order and divinely inspired genius. One could certainly argue that these historical high points were the exceptions and not the rule, and of course this may be fair enough. But even just a few decades ago, if you were dropped off in the middle of virtually any European or Nordic nation, or in the middle of America, you'd have found yourself dealing with a very different caliber of people in these regards. But I'd like to use an extreme example to disprove what I feel is a misapprehension here. Yes, it's true that many people right this moment are all but completely unsalvageable. They've stumbled so far down a dark path that they've completely lost their bearings, and their compass no longer points north. But when voicing ideas like I have in the latest video, it's a certain specific human type that most strongly resonates with and is intrigued by the possibility. This represents a self-selection of a subset of humanity. Further, if we wanted to do what the ancient Scythian communities and many present-day Amish and similar communities do, and bring back the idea of shunning or banishment, this means that not only would these communities be a unique selection of a type of person actively striving to be better and be around those seeking to be better in these regards, but for those that strongly transgress, there's always the threat of their being simply removed as a result. Combine both of these factors together, and I strongly believe you do potentially have a recipe for the cultivation of a very different and uniquely orderly type of environment. I'm not necessarily suggesting all communities should have such a policy, or even the specifics of how it might function if they did. I only use this as an example as to how and why a highly ethical and highly virtuous culture might be able to survive and thrive even in modernity. More than anything, this would simply need to be their conscious goal, to the extent that they crafted their culture around this goal on an ongoing basis accordingly. I absolutely believe it's an attainable goal, should we choose to consciously strive in that direction. And I think it's a mistake to believe these communities would suffer from the exact same maladies the broader world suffers from, and to the same degree. We all have a desire to belong, and in itself this isn't a bad thing, despite its being so misused and abused by parasitic power-seeking forces, so dominant at present. This desire to belong functions in a highly positive way in an honest and upright society. An individual simply knows if they step too far out of line too many times, they risk losing the respect of, and possibly their very ability to live amongst, their friends and extended family. And I tend to think this can act as a powerful orienting force. And the last point before we leave this topic, It's so easy to have an absolutely terrible impression of human nature right this moment, justifiably so. But we should always keep in mind that vice and degeneracy and baseness gets handed a megaphone and is ushered down a red carpet in our age. Meaning it's the worst types that tend to have the most influence, giving us an extremely disjointed picture of humanity at large. We would be aiming to do the opposite. Reward and incentivize the best types with greater powers and influence, and a conscious effort here would lead to the creation of a very, very different cultural environment. Number 5. At least one or two people mentioned the idea of democracy was what soured them on this approach, and it's important to clarify. I'm absolutely no fan of democracy, and in no way do I believe it to be the ultimate ideal, or the path that most of these communities might take. This shouldn't disturb or unsettle anyone. I'm equally against tyrannical government and forcible imposition. And my own opinions here are hardly all important, as each of these communities should blaze their own trail according to what they feel might be the ideal. But in fairness, it's important to note that democracy was mocked and despised by nearly every great thinker across the stretch of human history, and it should be obvious as to why. I'm always reminded of the Spartan Lycurgus's comment to someone who suggested he try democracy. He suggested that they try it first and begin in their own home. In other words, give their children, for example, equal powers and equal say. Democracy isn't an ultimate ideal because equality isn't a reality. It's an incredibly dangerous illusion, and in modern times it's become a false god. People differ, and they differ greatly, not just in their ability and competence, but in the amount to which they care about the realms of knowledge or politics or philosophy, etc. Giving an equal vote to a genuinely inspired genius who cares deeply enough to focus intently on all relevant machinations of politics and social order, and a total incompetent who avoids all political discussion like the plague, and is completely apathetic, is not a recipe for success in the long run. Similarly, those who are apathetic or have no skin in the game can often very easily have their votes bought, or otherwise be pushed and oriented in a certain direction by hidden hands to the same ends. This isn't really the place to elaborate on my own views here, but I very much like the conception of a heavily weighted vote, in which various factors affect the impact of an individual's vote strength. For example, picture a structure in which we're all able to lend a certain amount of vote strength to any other individual we wish, giving them a much greater say and influence and power. Number 6. A few comments took issue with the barter system idea, with one comment in particular speaking of the infeasibility of everyone having to work out the values of various goods, each and every time a deal needed to be made between himself and any other person. I think this is a mistaken and one-dimensional view of the broader idea and how it might actually function, which is largely my fault, I'm sure, considering I didn't elaborate a great deal. And something like this is probably what pops into most minds when they think of the concept of barter. To give an example of how this might be done in a more convenient manner, I mentioned the prospect of central hubs, which might take in goods from any individual, or distribute them to any other, or trade between each other as hubs in different communities. Picture these central hubs operating a bit like a pawn shop does, and that you might offer up whatever you're looking to unload, receive credit for anything you're willing to part with, and you're able to apply that credit toward anything else you might want to purchase. Farmers and those who raise food animals, I think, might make great use of such a structure. These central hubs might determine the rate they're willing to offer, and if it's appealing enough, you sell. And in exchange, you take what's needed, or hold on to something like an IOU. There are countless ways this could function in practice, and it's one of the things I'm most eager to hear discussed in our discussions. But I think it's a mistake to assume it'd be a needlessly complex headache, in which you'd have to freshly decide how many eggs or how many gallons of milk are equivalent to any other product or service at every turn. There simply has to be some means of lowering our taxable income to near zero, to avoid the parasitic leaching of our monies into the coffers of those actively working to disempower or destroy us. And I strongly believe that this is the type of end result we should seek, however it might manifest. And again, I'm doing the easy work here and laying out the broader ideas and conceptions I think have merit. What I so look forward to is the process of better minds than my own, more specifically educated and experienced on these topics, coming together to hash out something much more concrete and viable. Number 7. A few comments from those who already live essentially off the grid or in much more independent circumstances spoke to the difficulty of doing so and the dangers of romanticizing such difficulty. This is definitely a valuable point to keep in mind. But here's an important consideration. We spoke a moment ago about trying to avoid reinventing the wheel whenever and wherever possible. When an individual strikes out on his own, he's forced to reinvent several wheels, in a sense. He's forced to find his own solution to cover virtually all of his necessities, and this can make life very difficult indeed. But living in a community is very different in this sense, especially a community with a thoughtful and well-planned division of labor. Instead of forcing every last individual to become a master of 10 to 15 different trades and tasks and skill sets, and constantly bounce between them all to maintain subsistence-level existence, I envision that most communities will want to foster some very real specialization, as this saves an immense amount of time and prevents needless and redundant effort. But doesn't this foster independence, one might ask? To some small degree, sure, but it's not dependence itself that represents the most pressing problem at the moment. It's specifically dependence on forces that aren't kith or kin, aren't like-minded, or sympathetic, or in any way on the same page, or even decent, and in fact often seem to hate or despise us. Mutual dependence between friends and family, and mutually resonant folks that earnestly want the best for us, isn't such a bad thing, or such a risk. And this was our traditional mode of living throughout the vast majority of human history. That's not to say most individuals wouldn't want to cultivate a small garden, or perhaps have some chickens, or know how to hunt, or what have you. But this shouldn't be viewed as an absolute necessity in most of these environments. If we seek to allow all to live up to their specific fullest potential, part of this equation is minimizing needless busy work, unless this work is fundamentally gratifying or somehow deeply net positive in nature. I do envision us having masters in the field of electrical work or construction or water management or food production or clothing manufacture, etc. The massive difference will be that when virtually everyone is attempting to do something that has the potential to improve the lives of others, and when we're able to consciously eliminate vast swaths of professions and occupations that have become so far removed from the creation of real value, this means far less effort is required from each individual to more easily reach subsistence level, even to create a great deal of excess. An example I've mentioned in the past is modern occupations like advertising, and individuals working for two competing companies, jockeying to see who can out-advertise one another. What an abysmal waste of intelligence and time and energy this is. How far removed from directly benefiting the greater good. Anyhow, I don't mean to digress too far here. The main point is that those who have found their way in a solo manner, I have sincere respect for your efforts and achievements in doing so, and the knowledge you've certainly gained along the way. But it should be understood that our path might be a bit easier, at least once we get going and have a solid foundation under our feet. because the energetic and enthusiastic collective effort of many individuals representing every relevant skill set under the sun, engaging in some specialized labor, will always make for a far easier path than one in which each and every man is forced to master all of these facets by himself and continually jump between them. That's not to say that this path of complete independence doesn't have some significant high points. It absolutely can and shouldn't necessarily be discouraged, just that it perhaps shouldn't be seen as a necessity. In fact, one of the things that so intrigues me about these communities is how much less work we'll each need to do as individuals in the long run, with emphasis on long run there. It's important to make clear that I'm certainly not attempting to glorify backbreaking menial labor for its own sake, but rather fruitful, productive, and especially creative labor of a non-redundant and efficient and necessary sort. The various Amish communities have to deal with these questions constantly, and even they decide to proceed in varying ways. Some embrace an amount of technology to aid in their efficiency and output. Others reject it totally. I understand both paths, and suspect that a great many looking to form or join these communities might be drawn to both. One of the reasons those who work far harder tend to be so much healthier than the norm, psychologically speaking, is because, increasingly, we tend to so squander and misuse our free time, because, culturally speaking, we've been coaxed away from healthier habits and toward all that's degenerative. If we consciously set out to develop countless ways for people to spend this free time in better ways, and more fundamentally gratifying and healthy ways, then only being required to work a handful of hours each day could be the most highly positive development. And number 8. This comment had 3 parts of contention. Firstly, he says that white folks are too individualistic right now for this to work. Secondly, he says there is no way we could stop the, quote, glowies from getting involved and ruining this. Thirdly, he says we have work to do reclaiming our destiny. He's largely right. White peoples, broadly speaking, have been conditioned to be hyper-individualistic, and I'd suggest this is a conscious effort by some powerful forces and by design. But we simply must find a way back to our more traditional modes of thinking and living in this regard, or doom is guaranteed. If we can agree that we're faced on both the domestic and world stage by forces that seem to want us utterly disempowered or destroyed, we have to recognize that we have zero chance to combat or even defend against such a force without some amount of unity. And again, it's crucial to understand that we won't be attempting to force all down this path, but rather will be a self-selection of those who see the world in a similar way. And this is a powerfully positive thing. And in response to his second part, yes, of course, dishonest actors and intelligence agents and glowies and FBI types will try to get involved, and perhaps even succeed, despite our best efforts. So be it. Let them plow our fields, raise our cattle, manage our chicken coops. All we can do is our level best to prevent this, in every way that we're able. This is why I continually stress that this effort must remain clean, above board, and not only stand up to public scrutiny, but positively welcome such scrutiny. Meaning, if we're genuinely seeking to band together to do good for those currently suffering and getting an extremely raw deal, and if we're able to watch the way we speak and act to a degree and avoid trying to use this as a vehicle to confront these dark forces head on at every turn, we're largely immune to their machinations. No FBI agent will be able to push someone into violent action. Accusations that we're up to something nefarious will utterly lack evidence and be extremely difficult to prosecute, even within our wholly corrupted court system. The biggest danger might be some charismatic individual winning a sufficient number of people over to then derail that energy and enthusiasm in some unhelpful direction. But if we're vigilant, and if we try to create structures and hierarchies in a way that might help us sidestep this, even this would be made incredibly difficult, and could likely only occur at a small scale. And again, we can't let these types of fears forever paralyze us. At some point, we need to stand up. And if we fail to do this, our fate is sealed. It's really that simple. So, pushed by necessity, we must. Full stop. And this commenter's final point about our having work to do reclaiming our destiny, I couldn't agree more. This is precisely why I'm suggesting this path. Again, an atomized and individualistic people with no organization or unity can't act in any potent or meaningful way. It's an impossibility. This path, by contrast, would act as solid ground beneath our feet and help open several doors as a result. And lastly, number 9. And this one is a masterclass in demoralization, so I'll read it all in full to fairly deal with the points made. The first paragraph says, nice video, but sadly this is cope. Calls to return to the old always return in the waning stages of society. But you know as well as I do that we can never, quote, go back. You have more realizations upon your horizon. Change is a feature of life. Calls to return to anything will always fail. We can never go back. My response to this paragraph. It's true all is change and flux, and we can never, quote, go back. But this take is a fundamental misunderstanding of what's being attempted here. We are not trying to precisely recreate any period of time or any past state of affairs. Rather, we're referring to a handful of fundamentals as the solid ground beneath our feet, and from this ground, anything might grow. Whatever is cultivated as a result will certainly be something wholly new, albeit according to a handful of timelessly valuable themes. In other words, it's an attempt to throw out what has fared so badly for us: multiculturalism and cosmopolitanism, parasitism and consumerism, an uncontrolled obsession with the new and novel, with little to no thought to the longer-term costs, and simultaneously an attempt to re-embrace the broader concepts that have always worked so well for us historically. A culture of fruitful production and creation and hard work, homogeneity and societal cohesion and mutual love and respect, courage and loyalty, a consistent striving toward greater physical, mental, and spiritual health. The simplistic and silly caricature of our simply wanting to roll back the clock to the 1950s, or to the Bronze Age, or some specific moment in time, is ridiculous. I think most of us merely seek to return to the most positive, foundational elements of thinking and being that gave all of these moments in time their unique charm. The commenter goes on in the next paragraph. All these words like best, ideal, optimal, they indicate a lack of clear vision. Your word salads are skillfully crafted, but your ideas are not well developed and fail to account for the diversity in individual goals and standards. You are describing some dreamlike form of communism that will never exist. My response to this paragraph. He's right in stating that some of my chosen language could be viewed as vague, lacking specificity. But this is because I don't think any one person should be deciding precisely what these resulting communities might look like at this earliest of stages. I repeatedly hit upon certain themes that I think matter most, such as physical, mental, and spiritual health, and merit or excellence or mastery, to fully drive home and illustrate just how important I think these are as a foremost focus. He speaks of failing to account for diversity in individual goals and standards. Again, I think this misses the point almost entirely. If several of these smaller communities were to arise, each having a slightly different type of individual involved, slightly different aims and goals and structures, different orientation and guiding principles, this creates a situation where each individual might naturally gravitate towards that which best suits him. And this is what differentiates this from the forcible encroachment of modern globalism, which is doing all it can to force us all to sing the exact same tune. Now, I'd love to see these communities begin to draw closer and closer together over time, and slowly but surely shed some of their differences and be ever more aligned, but we can't expect that immediately at the outset. And until this happens, I'd suggest this idea perfectly accounts for the diversity in individual goals and standards, far better than our present living arrangements, to put it mildly. The dreamlike communism bit seems to be a cheap insult, attempting to discourage any unity that isn't exclusively oriented around consuming and the marketplace. But it's important to reiterate, these communities might develop any structure they feel is ideal. Nobody despises every last historical manifestation and effect of communism as much as I do. But at the same time, I feel nothing but disgust lately toward this mentality so pushed along by Fox News and the lukewarm conservative element that practically deifies our present form of capitalist consumerism as the pinnacle of human achievement. I'd love to see us live for more than the purchasing of the next toy, and almost exclusively chasing softness and ease and entertainment, and I think a great many share my opinions here. Such a lifestyle and mode of thinking and being has tremendous costs in the longer term, and serves to weaken and cheapen a person, and so lessen their vitality and sharpness and potency. Moving on to his third paragraph. Furthermore, the bartering system you propose has been tried and failed numerous times. Money of some form is needed to facilitate exchange between parties with no interest in a bartered arrangement. History has repeatedly shown that any form of money can function in this capacity. The problem is not money itself, but the people responsible for issuance and distribution of money. You are blaming the gun for murder and ignoring the person that pulled the trigger. My response: the barter idea is easy to misunderstand. As mentioned earlier, I think central hubs being the epicenter of most buying and selling might help eliminate much of the perceived hassle and headache. But at the same time, I very much look forward to ideas being voiced and constructively debated in our weekly discussions in the future. I am not the expert here. I'd like us to find a few individuals who've spent a lifetime considering such issues, importantly with the ability to entertain unconventional solutions, and hear these types engage in a fruitful back and forth. That said, I'd suggest that our system and structure of money, broadly speaking, has indeed been corrupted. After all, the very forces that own and operate the Federal Reserve printing press, that so devalues the dollar's worth, couldn't be more ideologically opposed to myself and the vast majority of you listening. This doesn't mean that I'm attacking all mediums of exchange, conceptually speaking, but I am seeking a path forward that might allow us to legally sidestep completely unjust and unhelpful tax burdens. I started with the idea of barter here for that reason, but I'm looking forward to much more discussion on these topics. And finally, the last paragraph of the comment. Every organization is and will be corrupted by individuals or minor groups acting in an interest which shares a component orthogonal to the organization. This is a theme of nature, a law, if you will. There are 0 examples in history or nature where this is not a true statement. Any well-conceived organization will account for this and incorporate irreversible self-destruction upon discoverance of the corruption. My response: speaking of word salads, this strikes me as some almost irrelevant, nihilistic sad sacchery. Of course, there are always bad apples, and these are impossible to fully avoid. And of course, any new development should be engaged in with open eyes, to be able to check these as effectively as is possible. And in fact, the structure should be consciously developed with the checking of these types foremost in mind. This should go without saying. Will these communities occasionally suffer from problems that have dogged humanity since the beginnings of recorded history? Of course. Is this somehow an argument not to attempt to create something vastly better than what we have now? No, it isn't. And so, that concludes the going over of the negative and critical feedback I was able to find. I'm sure I missed a few, please pardon me for that. And I hope my focus exclusively on the negative or critical comments wasn't a mistake. The vast majority were positive in nature. I just feel any venture or adventure like this needs to be able to be tried by fire, in effect, and come out the other side, if it hopes to be something lasting and stable. So, on an ongoing basis, I welcome these discussions. And speaking of, let's now segue to the topic of discussions, and some thoughts on how we might regularly hold meetings, and how these meetings might be the foremost guiding and orienting factor as to where this all heads in the future. For starters, I envision that these meetings and discussions will play the leading role in providing the shape and orientation of the efforts to come, and I even envision them being self-shaping in a sense. In other words, though the first discussion or two or three will be relatively informal and devoted to introductions and the loose airing of ideas and comments and critiques, after the second or third meeting, at least, I'd like to see this community begin to take some concrete shape and a clearer agenda and plan of action come into view. I'd like us to choose some discussion leaders or organizers to help host and manage these discussions. I'd like to see us settle on a relatively clear and easy to understand format and structure to the proceedings, and how exactly we carry them out, etc. Things will begin in a very open-ended way, and gradually set into a more firm and consistent structure. Expect it to be a bit messy, perhaps a bit disorganized. Expect some technical issues. Expect some bad apples or distractions, especially in the earliest stages. And especially since many of us don't live and breathe in this online world of tech, it's a given that we'll have some technical issues and growing pains. This isn't terribly important. What's important is that we quickly learn from all of these things, and we're able to establish some consistent, ongoing discussion capable of solving real problems, coming to agreement, moving forward, and generally making efficient progress in a positive direction. Here are some of my suggestions for all who'd like to participate. Try your best to limit yourself to approximately 2 to 5 minutes, at least for this first discussion. You'll be able to elaborate much more in the future, but we'd like to let as many people speak as is reasonably possible. Before you speak, try to ensure your volume is suitable and that people can hear you. As part of your speaking, feel free to invite people to new Twitter Spaces discussions, to be launched at the completion of this main discussion, to dive more deeply into more narrow and focused discussions of a given topic, or to simply get to know one another a bit better. For example, a group of people most interested in discussing the ins and outs of finding and purchasing land might be one valuable Twitter space for focused discussion. Or those dedicated to the discussion of the construction of unconventional homes, like sod houses or earthships or anything else, might be another. Or a discussion of all things barter system or economy related might be another. Just to mention a few ideas of a great many possibilities. But in short, feel free to mention, as you speak, an invitation to another discussion. I suggest trying to keep things relatively positive, and attempt to avoid getting too political, or too spicy, or controversial, or angry. I strongly believe these discussions need to be kept almost entirely free of this. We can certainly hold these talks elsewhere, but this weekly committee discussion meeting will be acting as our public face to the rest of the world that isn't us, including a great many people who might be curious and potentially interested in assisting, and who almost certainly lack the fuller context picture that many of you have, with regard to the dire state of things and the forces arrayed against us. On an ongoing basis, I'd suggest that we attempt to communicate in a way that doesn't scare these types away, and doesn't invite a great deal of negative scrutiny, or reports, or banned accounts, and so on. In this first discussion, feel free to talk about anything, a brief introduction to yourself or your small group if you've already formed one, or the nature of a group you'd be interested in starting, along with contact details to reach you for those interested. You might choose to discuss the ideas mentioned in the latest video, or new ideas that haven't yet been mentioned, or your skill sets and strengths, and how you might aid in such an effort. Anything you wish for this first meeting. Just try to keep it short and realize you don't need to get it all out in this one single 2 to 5 minute period of speaking. There will be many more opportunities in the future. One thing I'd like to see us think about and perhaps discuss is how to keep these talks and meetings optimally fruitful and engaging. And, for example, how to allow the better voices to speak more often, the more friction-inducing or crude or divisive or demoralizing or scattered or generally unhelpful voices to speak less, and how to do this on an ongoing basis without causing great offense to the latter group, or fostering some unhelpful public popularity contest. One idea I've had on this front would be to create a very simple, bare-bones website, which was just a single page, in which the names of every discussion participant might be added as we go, allowing everyone else to simply vote them up or down. The results of this voting wouldn't be public or visible to anyone except the tiny handful of those who will host these discussions, and these hosts might then use them as a guide as they call on new speakers. The voting would have to be restricted to those individuals we personally hand out logins to avoid abuse or manipulation by outsiders. And this idea is certainly up for discussion and debate, but it appeals to me as an extremely simple way to potentially keep things moving along effectively. One more thing we might seek to hash out within the first meeting or two is whether we should hold equivalent meetings on other platforms outside of Twitter. There will be some that refuse to use Twitter Spaces or even listen in anonymously because they so despise or mistrust the platform. And I'm not sure I'm comfortable simply leaving all these people out, especially since I understand and have some sympathy for their concerns here. It may be worthwhile to hold at least one parallel meeting, also once per week, elsewhere. The where is up for debate and discussion. And it'd be important that this parallel discussion is led by similar individuals and that it have similar aims and goals, broadly speaking. But I don't see how it could hurt to cast a wider net in this regard. Another thing that should play a prominent role in our discussions, though perhaps not until the second or third meeting, would be how to structure a fund similar to the concept I floated in the last video. How to take in monies, how to dispense them, how to decide who is most deserving, or the most viable candidates to receive. We might also want to create a small group devoted to each narrower aspect of the larger aim here. One group of individuals, ideally with some relevant expertise, devoted to finding the best and most cost-efficient land to purchase. Another group created to help rally funding and donation sources. Another dedicated to how to best use the land. Perhaps another dedicated to the most cost-efficient types of homes and structures we might create on these plots, and so on. Having some devoted specialization of labor in these respects might help things operate much more efficiently relative to not having such specialization. Some other things I'd like to see us keep in mind. Understand that this is a relatively broad tent. There may be those that despise the influence of technology. There may be individuals that consider keeping a firm handle on technology as our only hope in the longer term. There may be deeply spiritual people and others who are borderline agnostic. There may be crypto people, finance people, farmer people, all types. Our goal is to work together when and where we can, while we seek to create environments and cultures that best suit us all personally. In other words, many relatively different groups under a single common umbrella, and we should try not to say things that might alienate or cause unhelpful friction. I strongly encourage that we all seek to be relatively diplomatic and tactful. The individual communities we create might be much more narrow and focused in their approach and ideas and worldview, but with regard to this committee meeting dynamic in particular, We need to take it as a given that not everyone will be precisely eye to eye or on the same page to begin with. I think one of our most important topics of discussion over the coming weeks and months, by any objective standard, will be all things economic, and how we might cultivate a structure that helps eliminate waste, corruption, parasitism, and generally makes far more efficient use of our time and energy. Here is the main point I'd like to emphasize as we all ponder and discuss solutions on the economic system front. I'd suggest that in an increasingly globalized world, money has become the foremost cause of subversion and inversion of traditional power and influence hierarchies that once so justly rewarded merit and innate gifts. When the whole world is a singular marketplace without borders, a wealthy man anywhere can enjoy immense power or influence everywhere, behind countless fronts and proxies. And when this is coupled with the fact that so many truly terrible people are now becoming incredibly wealthy, and that this trend is without a doubt on the upswing, it's not difficult to see how this can have an incredibly degenerative effect. Every society and community becomes just another commodity to be bought and sold, and everything is cheapened as a result. We begin to seek mere economic utility over beauty, and people become grasping and materialistic and self-seeking, and thus prime targets to be bought into the service of Rothschild and Mammon. I strongly believe that the more independent we can become of this modern marketplace, the more promising our future. Anyhow, these are just my own ideas. The beauty of this adventure is that via these regular meetings, we can hopefully be flexible enough to adapt and improve and refine as things expand. Our goal should be to offer up our own best judgments to be considered each and every time we get opportunities to speak in the future, and to ensure we have a structure in place, allowing our best judgments to ultimately win out as often as is possible, whenever there are decisions to be made or important disagreements to be hashed out. I apologize that I'm currently in a place without reliable phone or internet access, but at the same time, none of this is really about me anyhow, and I never intended, nor do I feel best suited, to lead these discussions, or projects, or proceedings, or whatever they might grow to become in the future. My goal was to simply use my relatively modest platform to bring good minds and good people together, to start the all-important initial discussions. I still have some extremely important topics to cover and things to say in my upcoming creative projects, and I consider all of these efforts to be very much related, similar, and intertwined. In other words, I feel like my creative production speaking to our history, for example, is the area in which, personally speaking, I can do the most good at the moment. I hope to continue to step up to accomplish things I think are necessary, whenever and wherever I don't see others doing so, or where my reach across YouTube and social media might be helpful in doing so. But I hope to keep my own focus largely on the creative projects, at least for a bit longer, until I've voiced the things I feel incredibly compelled to voice. At which point, I'll be happy to play a more concrete leadership or organizing role, to the extent that I feel suited to it. But at the moment, I'm just trying to bring good people together. So, though I'll certainly be listening to every last one of these discussions in full, perhaps more than once, if possible, and possibly even chiming in occasionally, just know that I probably won't be some central driving force. Whatever results here, I'd like this all to be able to run completely efficiently, even if I were to disappear tomorrow. Or if any one of us was to disappear tomorrow, for that matter. I think striking that ideal balance between decentralization and organization will be key here. No single target of attack for those who'd like to destroy such efforts, but enough communication and cooperation to where every last individual doesn't have to reinvent every last wheel. Okay, I think that's about all for now. Stay tuned for an announcement in the coming days on Twitter and Gab and a YouTube post with regard to a specific date and time for our first discussion, anywhere from May 15th to May 20th. I sincerely hope you're all well, and thank you for listening.
This is the end, beautiful friend. This is the end, my only